All right, guys, today I want to talk about camera settings, aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, why I shoot the way I do, and why I think they are the best settings that you can have for real estate photography, or a good starting point for real estate photography and architecture and pretty much whatever you're going to be doing. So today we're going to be talking about interiors. We might hit exteriors and flash a little bit, but for the most part we're going to be talking about the biggest part of what real estate photographers do, and that's interior photography. So the shutter speed that I use is 1/125th of a second. And the reason why is because it's the best balance for all the interiors I shoot. I typically will only adjust my shutter speed because the good rule of thumb in general for everything that you do is you always want to give your sensor more light, meaning you want to allow more light to hit it, whether that is with a longer exposure time or a wider aperture before we adjust our ISO, because the ISO can increase the presence of noise and it can make our images have less image quality, less dynamic range, less sharpness. Just it makes for worse images. So the biggest thing that you want to do is leave that ISO alone and adjust your shutter speed and your aperture if you have to. The reason we also want to adjust our shutter speed and try to avoid adjusting our aperture is because f8 is where we want to sit for the sharpest, cleanest image possible with the most depth of field. Now, if I hit around 5 seconds of shutter time, that's about as slow as I want it to go. And the reason why is because you can introduce shake into it. You can bump the camera, the floor can move, things happen. And so having something at around 5 seconds is about my limit. Yours could be longer. When you get into twilights, that can be longer, but for the purpose of this, we're talking interiors. It's at that point that I would then start opening up that aperture to get more light in so I don't have to have such a long open shutter. And the aperture that I use is f8. Now, you can use higher apertures, but you will run into diffraction. If you don't know what diffraction is when the light clips the blades of your aperture blades as it clamps down, and they scatter in the light box, and it kind of makes your images look less sharp, a little bit fuzzy. They don't have as good of color reproduction. There is a prevalence of using f9 in real estate photography, and I don't know where that came from. Objectively, it is not a better aperture than f8. You can go look at Imatest, you can look at MTF charts, and you can look at reviewers online who do these reviews with focal charts and stuff like that. And you gain nothing for going above f8, and there are only very special cases like getting sun stars, doing focus stacking, just really certain niche things that you need to increase that aperture so that you can either have those sun stars show up or work in kind of a specialized area. But if you're using f9, you're really just fighting against yourself and increasing the amount of time that you're spending taking the pictures. And if you like to have, again, the sharpest photos possible, I highly recommend using f8. It is the best aperture across all lenses to use for the most balance of good shutter speed, sharpness, image reproduction, staying away from diffraction, and just an overall better experience when you're shooting interior photos. And finally, we're going to talk ISO. So for me, I like to use ISO 400. Now this will vary based on camera and how good it is with increasing its ISO, if it's ISO invariant, all those things. We're not really going to get into the technical side of ISO right now because it can be kind of a mud pit where there is a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of very technical things that come in with ISO. But for me, I use ISO 400. And the idea is that every time you increase your ISO, you are going to be losing image quality. Anything over your base ISO, which is typically 100. For my camera, it is 64 because Nikons have a base ISO of 64. At least the Z8 does. I know the Z7 does as well. I think maybe the Z9 does, but a base of 64, but typically it's going to be a base of 100. And anything above that will degrade your image quality. Make it a little bit more noisy, or make the prominence of that noise that's always there a little bit more prominent. It's also going to reduce your color reproduction and just, again, decrease image quality. And the reason I use ISO 400 is because, again, it's the best balance. It balances the 1/125th shutter speed I use. It helps me with the f8 aperture that I use because I like to balance everything out so that I have the sharpest image quality, a good shutter speed that keeps me moving and keeps me efficient throughout the house, but it also balances that image quality because my Z8 is incredible at anything under, I mean, even 6400 is still pretty good on the Z8, but I like to stay below 500 where that second ISO ISO gain kicks in, because you're really talking a negligible difference in like image quality loss as you increase it above that base. It's almost imperceptible. So that's where I sit. But again, typically anything above 400 is where you're going to start hitting those higher ISOs, and it's going to start making that noise more prominent. So make sure you try and keep it as low as is comfortable for you. Test it out and see what works for you. But ISO 400 on my Nikon Z8 is what I prefer. And that's it. Today we talked about shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. 1/125th of a second on that shutter speed, f8, and an ISO of 400 strikes the best balance on my Nikon Z8. Anything more on the aperture really doesn't help you out any. Again, that f9 is just a strange aperture to me, and I'm not entirely sure where it came from. The shutter speed, anything lower than 5 seconds is usually where my line is. I don't like to go longer than that on my interiors because there's just such a high chance of introducing noise or bumping it, and introducing camera shake. And finally, the ISO I typically stay away from unless I have to increase it, is the last thing that I touch, because increasing that ISO is a one-to-one loss every time you click it up of image quality. There is always a degradation of image quality the higher you go on that ISO, and it is going to be camera specific, because older cameras, smaller crop sensor cameras, things like that, they are going to have different ISO tolerances, and they are going to have different noise patterns and things like that. So it's important for you to understand that about your camera and finding out what the best balance is for you. I appreciate all of your guys' support. Thank you for watching. Have any questions, please let me know. Thanks again, and we'll see you on the next one.